So our guest speaker today is Dr. Auriel Fournier from Mississippi State University. She got a PhD last year from the University of Arkansas. She's a conservation biologist. She was really working and doing all sort of types of ecological research, going from the very quantitative to the very fieldwork oriented. And I'm the least qualified person in the world to say that, but she's an extremely accomplished field ecologist. Just sort of move from doing fieldwork into more conservation science and stakeholder engaged research. And so the presentation today is going to be a sort of story of how you move from a PhD research into your current projects.
Yeah.
So,
thank you. Well, I'm excited to be here today to share with you all some of my PhD work and then also what I'm working on now at Mississippi State, both of which kind of fall into this category of conservation puzzles and trying to solve a rather complex problem using either a unique combination of field and quantitative skills, or in the case of my postdoc now, a lot of stakeholder engagement and quantitative tools. So we're going to talk about problems today on kind of two scales. We're going to start by talking about my PhD work, which is relatively small scale. We're going to be talking about one family of birds, the rails, and we're going to be talking about them during one time of the year, autumn migration. Also within one state, we're going to be talking about just Missouri. So kind of a very specific problem. And then we're going to go up to a very large scale problem, which is trying to conserve birds across the entire Gulf of Mexico system. It's over 500 species of birds across a very wide variety of habitats. And trying to bring in all of the different stakeholders that are part of that system. And so kind of our two goals today are to better understand the migration ecology of a very secretive family of birds, the rails, and then also understand how decision science can help us to be better prepared to address areas of uncertainty, whether that be about a particular species or about a big problem like this. This is a photo from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which was the largest oil spill to happen in the US. It happened 7 years ago. And a lot of my work in the Gulf of Mexico is in response to that oil spill and the continuing restoration efforts. So just a little bit of background. Wetlands in North America, especially within the continental United States, have experienced widespread loss. In the central part of the United States, where I've been working for the past couple of years, we've lost between 70 and 90% of our wetlands. And this really changes how we think about the remaining wetlands and how we think about their purpose on the landscape. As a result of all that wetland loss, most of our public wetlands, so wetlands that are in state and federal hands, are very heavily managed through what's called multi-species management. They were originally set aside back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to provide habitat for migratory waterfowl. We're still doing a really good job of providing migratory waterfowl habitat, but since then we've started to better understand that these wetlands are also really important for a lot of other organisms. And so this puts a lot of increasing pressure on an increasingly small number of wetlands to do many, many, many different things. All the wetlands that I work on are also part of the Missouri and Mississippi River drainages. So they're also serving very important purposes for flood control and water quality. Some of them are also very close to large cities. And so flood control is incredibly important as we think about, well, should we flood this wetland or should we flood the city of St. Louis? And so there's a lot of different pressures on these wetlands. And a lot of the management, when we do have the ability to manage, is very limited without good data. And so today we're going to talk about rails, which is one particular family of birds, trying to understand when they migrate, what kind of habitats they use, and how they're moving around the landscape. Because right now we don't really know, which really limits our ability to manage them. So one thing I want to draw everyone's attention to first is that the wetlands that we're going to be talking about today are impounded wetlands. And so these are wetlands that have levees around them. You can kind of see these shapes here. These are a bunch of different wetlands on Swan Lake National Wildlife Refuge in Missouri. And so because the landscape in Missouri and across much of the central US has been so heavily impacted by people, the natural hydrology is greatly disturbed. And so these wetlands cannot maintain themselves as wetlands because we've tiled everything to the point that the water drains too quickly. And so to have wetlands, we have to box them in with levees and manually pump water in, let water out, and disturb the soil. So these are by no means beautiful, pristine natural wetlands, but they can be beautiful and very interesting in their own way. And timing is really, really important in managing these wetlands because they're more or less completely reliant on people for any kind of disturbance management. So this is the state of Missouri where I work. It's located here in the central US. The Mississippi River runs along the eastern part of the state, and the Missouri River comes down here through the northern part of the state. So all of these sites are part of the Missouri or Mississippi River drainages. NWR stands for National Wildlife Refuge, so those are federal properties, and then CA is Conservation Area, which are our Missouri state properties. And so all of these properties are restored wetlands, so they were agriculture at one point, and then they were purchased back by either the state or the federal government and turned back into wetlands. The most recent one was in the 1980s. Most of them were in the 60s and 70s. So the group of birds that I keep talking about is rails. So these are members of the family Rallidae. If we look at around the world, there's around 160 extant species of Rallidae, though a lot of them have only been seen a handful of times by Western science, and so their exact status is not known. Here in North America, rails require wetlands throughout their life history. Most of them are migratory, and so they're using different wetlands across North and into Central and South America throughout the year. Rails are remarkably good colonizers. They're very good at getting to a place where there aren't any birds yet. So if we look worldwide in remote islands in the South Pacific and South Atlantic, we see endemic species of rails where rails arrived. In most cases, very quickly lost the ability to fly and became their own species. So they're a really neat family of birds. Many of them are threatened or declining. And in a lot of cases, we aren't really sure because we don't have good information. And they're also a really good way of connecting really diverse stakeholders. Across much of the US and parts of Canada, several species of rails are game species, but they're also very heavily sought after by birders and other nature enthusiasts. So they can be a really good group of birds to bring together a more wider group of folks who enjoy birds in a variety of different ways and get them kind of excited about wetland management. They can also be a really great way of looking at ratios of mercury and other heavy metals in wetlands and in the systems that they use. I'm not going to talk about that work today, but if that's of interest to you, I'm happy to talk to you about it after. So this whole idea of detection probability, if you don't do a lot of field surveys, this may not be familiar to you, but the idea is, what are your chances of seeing something, assuming that it's actually there? So if you work with something that is very large or very conspicuous or very noisy, detection probability is probably very close to 1. You have a really good chance of knowing that something is there if it's actually there. If instead you study something that is the size of a human fist or slightly smaller and is mostly brown and spends most of its time in very dense vegetation and doesn't very frequently vocalize, you don't have a very good chance of seeing it even if it is there. And so a lot of the work that we do with rails is trying to find ways of surveying for them, either using things like broadcast calls to try and encourage them to call back to us, or actually going out into the wetland and flushing them out of the wetland to maximize our chance of encountering the bird and actually knowing that it's there when it is. The reason this is such a big problem is that if you go out and do surveys, and let's say you have 20 sites and you see rails on 3 of them, and then you don't see them on the other 17, well, are there actually rails there or not? And if you say that there aren't, it's really going to change how you think about management, even though some of those zeros are probably what we call false absences. There are cases where there was a bird there and you just didn't see it for any number of reasons, usually for rails because they are incredibly sneaky. And so the reason that this is really important is because, especially when we're talking about migratory birds, if we don't know when they're migrating, or if we miss part of their migration, it can be really difficult. And so what we have here are 3 species of rails. This here is the king rail, Virginia rail, and sora. And so these purple dots are when the first day of spring that a bird was detected in a trap that used a broadcast call to lure the bird into the trap across 6 years. And then these blue and green dots represent data from other sources. And so these 3 here are older data from northwestern Ohio. And so these are kind of anecdotal records from birders. And then this dark green dot represents eBird data. eBird is this very, very large database run by Cornell where if you go out and go birding, you can submit what you see. And so this kind of represents what birders, people going out and looking for birds are seeing on the landscape. And so one important thing to know about king rail right off the bat is that king rails are endangered in the state of Ohio, where this data is from, and we didn't see very many of them, and so there's not a whole lot we can say about this top bit other than here are 3 data points. We need to do more work on king rails. But for sora and Virginia rail, the thing that I think is the most interesting is that in several of the years, we're catching birds up to 2 weeks before the birders are first seeing them, and that's what this dark green dot represents. And that's because, for the most part, birders are going out to a wetland, they're standing on a levee, they're looking for the birds, they're probably going out at the right time of day, but for the most part, they're not detecting the birds when they're there. So the birders are getting a lot of false absences. But when we actually use a trapping method that uses a call that lures the birds into the trap, we're actually able to better understand when they're arriving during migration. And a 2-week difference in understanding when a bird arrives during migration is really big when you're trying to time when habitat needs to be available for that species. So that was during spring migration. For my PhD work, we were looking at autumn migration. And so autumn migration presents some additional challenges in that while the birds will respond to broadcast calls during the spring, they will not respond to them during the autumn, or at least not in any predictable way. They will occasionally, but not the way they do in the spring. And so what we had to do was go out and try and develop some kind of new survey method. And so what you can kind of see here is I'm riding on an ATV or a four-wheeler. And so we actually take these through the wetland at night and we flush birds. So instead of doing a song-based survey, we're doing a visually based survey. And so people are always like, oh, that sounds really fun, and it is, but it also requires you to have a very specific search image. For instance, there's a rail right here in this photo, and maybe you can see it a little bit better here, it's blown up. But you have to be able to see these birds like in the vegetation. So it requires a very different kind of skill set, which I really like, and it's been quite fun to work on. But kind of some of the quantitative stuff behind this is so we go out and we drive these surveys, and so if you'll bear with me here, pretend all these black dots are rails that are out in the wetland, and this is a transect that we're driving on the ATV. And when we detect a rail, the dot turns red. And so every time we detect a bird, we measure the distance from that bird to our transect line. And then at the end of our transect, we get a distribution of distances like this. And so these dark bars represent the counts of the birds that we have seen and how far they are away from the transect. With the idea being that something that is farther away from you is more difficult to detect than something that is very close. And then we can use hierarchical models, in my case through the unmarked package in R, to estimate these white parts of the bars, to actually understand what the density is in a given wetland, even if we're not able to detect all of the individual rails. I'm not going to get into this much more than that. Happy to talk about it more. I think this stuff is really, really cool. But we're going to dive more into the results. So today we're just going to talk about Sora, but there are a couple other rail species that I've worked with over the past couple of years. And so these are the density estimates that we were able to get across 5 years of surveying for Sora in Missouri. And so we start our surveys in early August and we end them at the end of October. And so across these 5 years, we were able to show a very clear peak in Sora migration in the latter part of September, and then it trickles off through October. We know that there are Sora continuing to migrate through Missouri in the early part of November, but that is when waterfowl hunting season begins, and I don't want to be out in these wetlands during waterfowl hunting season. So this is the data that we have for those. An important thing to kind of understand about why this peak being over here is so important is this is when waterfowl start arriving in the state, and they don't really come through until the largest numbers until later in November. And so if managers are going out and managing our state and federal properties with waterfowl as their main objective, they're not providing habitat for the majority of our rails, which is where a lot of the more experimental work in my PhD came from. And so there's a lot of questions about what role timing plays in wetland management in these impounded wetlands. There's a lot of questions about when we should flood habitat and how quickly we should flood it. There's a lot of questions about when we should do disturbance management. And we know that the flooding of habitat is really important for a lot of species, especially a lot of migratory birds. Even if the vegetation community is exactly what they need, if the wetland is dry, a lot of migratory wetland birds will not use that wetland. And so, if habitat is flooded too early or too late, it isn't serving those goals. And so this is kind of where my first kind of jump into decision science came, which then led to my postdoc work. And so decision science is a way of kind of reducing bias as we answer questions, often questions that have a lot of uncertainty around them. And it's our attempt to eliminate mental shortcuts. And so today we're going to be down in this part of the graph. We have a clear objective. We want to understand how we can manage for rails while also managing for waterfowl. And in the current case, we have some uncertainty in the science. We have some uncertainty in the exact relationships between things, which is what the latter part of my PhD tried to solve. There are other parts of decision science that deal with these other parts of the graph. If you have a group of stakeholders that don't have clear goals, or if they don't agree on the same set of information, or think that the other side of the room just isn't using the same facts, you need a very different kind of science. But if you can at least get everybody to agree to the same kind of information, we can start doing something called structured decision making. And that's what we're going to talk about for most of the rest of today. The really great thing here is you can have a common objective among many stakeholders, and there can still be uncertainty, and that uncertainty can come from not understanding an ecological relationship. Like when in the middle of my PhD, we didn't really understand if we flooded wetlands earlier for sora, what impact that would have on waterfowl, but it can also mean an uncertainty in the way the values play out across the group. So you can bring together different stakeholders who value a resource in very different ways and work with them to elicit a quantitative representation of their values, and then use that to find an optimal solution. So it's a really good way to unite stakeholders around a common objective. And so in the wetland context, our objective is to manage wetlands for a wide suite of migratory birds. Specific to my project, we're just talking about waterfowl and rails. And so our uncertainty comes from if flooding wetlands earlier in autumn migration will impact the later migrating waterfowl species. And so there were a lot of managers who were very concerned that if we flooded wetlands early through rails, they didn't doubt the rails would respond to that. That seems fairly logical. But there was concern that by flooding them earlier, we would see faster senescence and dieback of vegetation when the waterfowl arrived in November, which would then hurt waterfowl. Which are a management priority for the state and the federal government, and are also highly sought after by duck hunters. And duck hunters are definitely a group that will be very loud at the table if the waterfowl aren't around. So what we did to kind of examine this uncertainty was we designed a 3-year experiment. And so at all those different conservation areas and national wildlife refuges I showed you earlier, we had 2 poundments selected, and they were assigned randomly to either an early flooding treatment or a later flooding treatment in 2014. The early flooding treatment began in early August and came up to 15 centimeters of water by the middle of September. The later flooding treatment did the same pattern, but it just started it in the middle of September and then kept it throughout the winter season. And so in the first year, they were randomly assigned. In year 2, they were flipped. And then in year 3, they were kept constant. And we used this design to help us better eliminate any kind of noise created by the surroundings of that impoundment. Some of these impoundments are surrounded by other wetlands. Some are right next to the Mississippi River. Some are surrounded by agriculture. One of them is right next to a chemical plant. Like there's a lot of different things that could influence this wetland, but hopefully through this design, we're able to eliminate some of that noise and just understand how these 2 treatments impact the birds. And so I went out and I did rail surveys throughout the autumn season, and then throughout the winter, the managers all did weekly waterfowl counts so that we were able to compare the response of the rails with the response of the waterfowl. And so there's quite a bit of quantitative stuff behind this as well. We used a lot of admixture models, but basically the take-home message is we have a positive response by sora. So sora are using our earlier flooded impoundments in higher densities than our later flooded impoundments, which makes a lot of sense. These birds like wetlands that are flooded, and since we're flooding them earlier, they're using them more. And we didn't see any difference in waterfowl use across our 3 years. We collected, because we were asking managers to do something in addition to their already very large jobs, we just got counts of waterfowl. We did not get species-specific counts, and so there is some concern that this no difference may be covering up some species-specific relationships, but when we just look at the number of waterfowl, so that's ducks, geese, and swans that are in a given wetland, we don't see any difference between the 2 treatments. So again, the timing of this habitat is important, and through this 3-year process, we were able to kind of reduce some of our uncertainty about how we can support sora without having a negative impact on waterfowl. Like any good project, this then led us to like a million other questions that we want to answer, and Missouri Department of Conservation, who funded my PhD, is going to be working on better understanding some of those relationships in the future. And so this is one example of how we can use this kind of structured decision-making process to frame kind of a smaller scale problem. But what if we want to look at something at a much larger scale? So what if we want to look at something at the scale of the Gulf of Mexico, which is a very large place with a lot of very complicated things going on within it? And so before I jump into this part, I want to acknowledge that I started this postdoc in April. The group that I'm working with in this work that I'm presenting has been going on for the past 6 years. And so there's a lot of other people who contributed way more than I have to this at this point. We'll get into that here in a bit. So again, coming back to decision science, we're going to be talking again in the structured decision-making part of this graph. And so our clear objectives in this case have to do with how we want to coordinate bird conservation efforts throughout the Gulf of Mexico in response to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. We're given the opportunity to have this very clear objective and to bring all these different stakeholders to the table because BP is paying out a very large settlement for restoration efforts because of the spill. And so we're trying to find a way to use that restoration money in the most effective way possible to do the most good for birds in the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, so our challenge is that in the past we've had a very disjointed and inefficient bird monitoring system that has failed to address a lot of the complexities and the interactions in the Gulf of Mexico. We have a lot of really, really great graduate work that is done in the Gulf of Mexico, but a lot of these projects are 2, 3, or 4 years long, which doesn't really give you the good time scale that you need to understand a lot of processes, especially in a system that deals with extreme weather events that don't happen on a yearly basis, including most notably hurricanes. We also have over 500 species of birds that use the Gulf of Mexico in a given year. This includes all the different species that migrate through the Gulf of Mexico. We have a lot of different stressors, hurricanes, climate change, a lot of different anthropogenic ones, including oil and gas development, tourism, the fishing industry. So there's a lot of different stressors on the system. And there's also a lot of different funding bodies, both environmental, economic, and otherwise, that are interested in keeping the Gulf of Mexico system working well. And so this has kind of been the challenge the bird conservation community has had for a long time. And the problem was especially that we didn't have any kind of funding available to us that was able to go across state boundaries. A lot of these, even federal money, is oftentimes allocated at the state level, and so it can be very difficult for states to work together. I realize that sounds really silly, but it is the way it is. And so the BP money has given us an opportunity to come together and try and define our values as a bird conservation community that we can then give to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which is one of the trustees that's been told by the courts that they will be allocating the money from the oil spill. And so out of this, about 6 years ago, rose the Gulf of Mexico Avian Monitoring Network, which is who I work for now. So this is 45 partners, state and federal agencies, tribal nations, nonprofits, academics. We have 2 different oil company biologists that are a part of our group. So we're a very, very large group. Over 200 people are involved. And what we're trying to do is define a way of meeting this objective, maximizing the usefulness of bird monitoring data to support conservation and restoration decision-making. And while the problems that we're dealing with as a group are very much for the entire Gulf of Mexico, we are dealing just with the northern Gulf of Mexico for our project because that is the area defined by the US federal courts as the area of interest for the BP oil spill. Even though there was definitely impacts of the oil spill in the Mexican part of the Gulf, we're just dealing with the northern Gulf of Mexico. And this order as defined by the courts, there's a long explanation for why it is that way. If you want to talk about it, we can. It's really not that interesting. And it's very, very complicated. And so one thing that we've gone about as a group that is a little bit different than the way that a lot of conservation planning efforts go is that we're prioritizing actions and not species. And so Jim Lyons, who is a federal scientist at Tucson, just outside of DC, is one of my supervisors. He's very big on this idea of trying not to fall into these 6 common mistakes in conservation priority setting. This is a paper in Conservation Biology. And these are a couple of them. So one of the mistakes is not prioritizing actions and instead prioritizing species. And so the reason that this is a trap that a lot of times we fall into is, a lot of times as ecologists, we have like a favorite species or a favorite group of species, and that's really like all we want to focus on, even though there might be a set of actions that very well help us understand what's going on with our favorite species, but could also help us to better understand the ecosystem as a whole, or another taxa, or another group of species. We're also, as a group, using structured decision-making to try and address these other 3 mistakes. One is arbitrariness. So we're trying to create a very transparent and quantitative framework so that it's very easy to communicate to folks why we're making the decisions that we're making and why we value what we value. On that same note, we're trying not to have hidden value judgments. I'll get into this here a bit more in a moment, but we're actually like explicitly drawing out how we value things and then writing out why we value them. And then oftentimes these plans act as if failure is not possible. failure is most definitely always possible, at least in conservation planning. And in our case, it certainly is as well. And so we're constantly trying to check ourselves and say, all right, here's where we want to be. If we got halfway there, would that be failure, yes or no? At what point would we still be excited about our results and trying to set realistic goals that way? So I know there's a lot going on here, but what I want you to focus on are these top bits. But what this is so through the process of expert elicitation, which is getting a group of stakeholders together and having an elicitator who is not a member of that stakeholder community work with that group to define their values, we've defined this objectives hierarchy. And so what this allows us to do is each of these boxes has a value function behind it, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. It's basically a quantitative way of describing how we value a thing. But at its core, what we have is we as the bird conservation community, we value rigorous data collection, defined more specifically as these things. We value data that has integration potential. So we want to move away from having a master's student who does a really good job collecting data for 2 years, but they collect it in such a way that it doesn't talk to any of the other data within the Gulf of Mexico. And then we also want relevant data, and we've defined that in 3 different kind of categories. One is management effectiveness. So we want to answer relevant questions that better help us manage our ecosystems. We want to answer more relevant questions that help us understand the status and trends of species that we don't understand very well. And then we also want to answer relevant questions related to ecological process. So ecological process is stochastic events and larger events that we can't control, things like hurricanes, sea level rise, things that are a little bit beyond our management action. There are certainly people who have argued with me that you can manage hurricanes and sea level rise, and that is a different conversation. But for management effectiveness, we're talking about like what time of year do you go out and harvest trees in a forest? What time of year do you go out and do a burn in a wetland? Things like that. This is kind of our defining our values and our goals. And so behind each of these, we have a value function. Today we're going to just look at the data management one. And so behind each of these, we have a function. And so we have a value associated with that node in the hierarchy that goes from 0 to 1. And then this x-axis can be very wide-ranging depending on what this particular node is about. And so for some of these nodes, it's like, all right, you are working in salt marsh. Salt marsh is actually not that much of the habitat in the Gulf of Mexico. Over half of our area is marine habitat. And so because you're working in a salt marsh, I think it's 18%. And so you would get 18%, and that curve is similar to this, but not quite. And that will give you a value for that. In the case of our data management plan, we want every project that gets funded with BP money to have some kind of data management plan. And so you get scored on the 0 to 4 process on whether or not you have a general recognition of data management, if you have an incomplete plan, if it's complete, but it lacks a few things, or if it's actually a really robust plan. And so we go through and we score each of these things. So each one will get a value. And then each of these nodes has a weight, which are also determined through expert elicitation. And so then your values are multiplied by your weights, and then they're summed. And so each project ends up with a score between 0 to 1. And then that ends up in here, and I realize this is really ugly, but bear with me. I hope that this will explain how this works. So each project is a row. It has its associated costs in US dollars, and then it has its benefit score. And so this is the score between 0 and 1. So we take those value functions, we multiply them by the weights, and we sum them, we get the benefit score. And then we can use optimization to pick out a certain set of projects based on portfolio constraints. So in this portfolio, the only constraint that I've put on it is a budget. I've said that I want it to be less than $1,450,000. And so the optimization algorithm goes through and it puts in different combinations of zeros and ones and finds the combination of projects where the cost is less than this, but it has the highest summed benefit score. These other columns here represent other kinds of constraints that we can put on the system. In this case, it's Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, which are the 5 states around the Gulf of Mexico. And so one of the things that the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation has talked about is how do we put constraints to ensure that Texas and Florida, because they represent most of the coastline, don't end up with all of the money, because we definitely want some of the money to still go to Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And so what we can do is we can go say, all right, we need to have at least one project in every state. Or we can also make it more complicated. Like for every 3 projects that Texas gets, there has to be at least 1 project in Alabama or something like that. And so we can do a lot of different kinds of combinations of constraints, which represent the values of the decision maker, and the values of the conservation community are also being represented in these benefit scores. So this is just some other examples of types of constraints we could use, along with a cute bird photo in case your brain is starting to hurt. And so we can definitely use cost. That's something that most decision makers are really interested in, is cost. Balance of habitats. So that table showed you a balance of geographies. We can also say we want to have a wetland project, a forest project, a marine project. We could have a certain number of projects on private land or a certain number of projects on public land. We could include capacity building of a certain skill set as a constraint, or a certain number of endangered species. The number of constraints is really up to the decision maker to come up with, but there's a lot of different ways we can do them. And so this is looking at 2 different constrained optimizations. So this black curve represents our Pareto efficiency curve for just looking at cost. So this is a portfolio. So a portfolio is the projects that are selected by our optimization. And this is its budget ranging in millions. And so this is the best you can do given a certain budget with no constraints other than cost. This purple line represents the best that you can do given cost and a constraint that you must have 1 project from each of the 7 taxonomic groups. So we have seabirds, land birds, marsh birds, waterfowl, wading birds, raptors, and shorebirds. And so if you want to have at least 1 project across all of those, you get a different curve. And it turns out that you also can't actually fund anything until you get to $3.5 million. And you're still going to have a slightly less optimum than if you just go with cost. And so all of these points under here are other randomly generated portfolios that are suboptimum. And so this kind of shows us how, when we think about decision making and how humans usually do it, humans are really good at making decisions. If the options available to them are like less than 5 options, we're pretty good at comparing things. But once we get more than 5 options, we start taking mental shortcuts. And those mental shortcuts are often influenced by our own kind of biases and perceptions of the world, and they can lead to some very suboptimal choices. And so this is one way of trying to get around that, because if you're trying to compare 30 proposals, it can be really difficult to do it in an objective way. This may still seem really subjective to you. You were not the first person to have thought that. And so these green dots here represent, I think it's 8 portfolios that we've pulled out to do a sensitivity analysis on. So I want to bring you back here and remind you of these 5 bigger categories: management effectiveness, status and trends, ecological process, integration, and rigor. Because instead of showing you the sensitivity analysis for all 27 nodes, which even I have a really hard time looking at, I'm going to show it to you for these 5. And so what we have here is this is the weighting of each of these kind of master nodes. This dotted line represents if we divided them equally, so they would each get 20%. The solid black line represents how they're currently weighted by the GOMAN community. And so what this allows us to do is look, and so under our current scenario, this dark green line, so portfolio H, has our highest benefit score. And so we can see if we increase our weight on management, so if we go this direction, H stays on top, I think it's until like 0.31, and then this light purple one, which is C, takes over, and then eventually A takes over. So if we really, really want to change our values of our community and just put all of our weight on management, we will get a different answer. And that's true for a couple of these. Integration, if we also greatly increase the weight on integration, we will get a different answer. But in all of these cases, we would have to shift the weight more than 15% to get a different response. Which to us suggests that our values are being represented in such a way that is not entirely arbitrary, because they're fairly well distributed across the 5. In some cases, we are weighting them more than 20, in some cases less than 20, but they're still pretty well distributed, and you would have to change the weighting a lot to get a different response. We're also, right now, I don't have it finished yet, but another thing we're looking at is how does changing the weighting change the projects that are selected? So in this one, these portfolios, the projects within them are staying the same, and we're just changing the weighting around. But if we change the weighting, we might also select different projects. And so that's something I'm working on now. It turns out to not be nearly as straightforward as it may sound. So moving forward with the Gulf of Mexico Avian Monitoring Network, very strangely called GOMAN, we have a decision support tool, which is the stuff I've talked about today, that will be given to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and also made publicly available. And we've got a manuscript in prep. If you're interested, I can get you a copy. We're also working on a Gulf of Mexico-wide monitoring plan. So that entire community of practice, that entire 200 people, 45 organization body is writing a monitoring plan for the next 20 years for the Gulf of Mexico. And we're hoping that that will be available next autumn. And we also have a case study manuscript being written up about that process, if that's of interest to you. So to wrap all of this up, conservation puzzles are everywhere. Today I've kind of presented two very different puzzles that are using some of the same tools of decision science to answer their questions. The right methods can help inform our choices, whether those methods are going out on an ATV and flushing rails because they won't respond to your calls, or whether they're working with a group through expert elicitation to look at value functions. And you know, they can really help us kind of answer our questions in a more transparent way. So thank you to a whole bunch of folks. These are all my technicians that worked on my PhD project, who this data would definitely not be available if they hadn't been a part of it, and then the various funding agencies from